And Vice President Harris during that trip to Africa. Democratic Senator Chris Coons is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and chairs the Subcommittee on African Affairs. Senator Chris Coons, thank you so much for being with us. So obviously we've talked about this. You've been on my show so many times now. I mean, we've talked about this idea that you've got the US, China and Russia obviously vying for influence in Africa at the same time. There are some African countries who are going to work or going to want to work with all three of those nations. What are your thoughts on that? If they choose to work with the United States, how important is it to you that they only work with the United States and not, for example, Russia and China?
Well, Zain, Vice President Harris had a very successful week in Africa, and a lot of her message was we are here with an open hand as positive partners, not to demand exclusive relations with the United States, not to say you have to choose between China, Russia, and the United States, but instead to be available as a positive and constructive development partner. Vice President Harris focused on some of the most positive, hopeful aspects of U.S.-Africa relations, investing in the transition to a digital economy, meeting with different creative organizations, whether in film or fashion, talking about how together we can tackle the challenges of climate and conservation. I was thrilled to be a part of that trip, but as you know, Zain, I've also traveled to many other African countries, both before and following the Vice President's visit, and I have the same perspective. We need to show up, we need to demonstrate that we're there for the long term, and we need to be good and open-handed partners with our African friends and allies.
Let's talk about human rights, especially in Ghana and Uganda. I mean, obviously, the Vice President didn't travel to Uganda this time, but of course, she was in Ghana. A lot of focus has been, of course, on this bill that's floating around in Ghana that is very, very anti-LGBTQ. Very similar to the bill that we're seeing in Uganda as well, in terms of limiting the rights of people who identify as gay in Ghana, in terms of punishing advocates for the LGBT community, and also promoting conversion therapy as well. I know that the Ghanaian president has touched on this idea that perhaps the bill will be watered down. I'm sure Vice President Kamala Harris raised the issue with the Ghanaian president. What was said and what came out of that?
Well, Zain, I don't think it's appropriate for me to characterize what was said in the bilateral meeting between our Vice President and the President of Ghana, but I will say that more broadly, across a number of engagements in Ghana and Uganda and elsewhere, I've been an advocate for LGBT rights, for a full and broader understanding of human rights, both on the continent and globally. That's not always welcome as a matter of input. I've had a number of vigorous exchanges with heads of state on the continent who politely say, leave us to our values and our priorities. We hear you. That's how you in the United States choose to organize your society, but we have a different view. I think it is important that we continue to fight for civil society, for safe space, for advocates for the LGBTQ community, and in particular to push back forcefully against those laws which are being considered or even adopted that criminalize advocacy or same-sex relations. And there's a number of countries that have recently taken aggressive steps in that direction. I don't think we should apologize for our values as a nation or hold back from sharing what we view as critical aspects of global human rights.
When you talk about pushing back forcefully, I mean, there are a number of people who say, look, the sort of one leverage that the US has, especially over Uganda, is, of course, in economic aid. Do you think that, let's say, if this bill actually becomes law, especially in Uganda, that the US should say, OK, well, we're going to restrict the amount of aid we send you? I mean, obviously, that is controversial. Some people say it could backfire in terms of the impact it has on the LGBTQ community there, because people might take out the anger on them. But what are your thoughts on using that leverage that the US has?
Zain, I think implicit in my saying earlier that we need to be an open-handed partner is that we should be cautious about when we go all the way to imposing sanctions or cutting off aid or denying access to important American programs, whether it's AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that provides duty-free, quota-free access to the United States market, or restricting our aid partnerships. We have done so in a number of cases recently where countries have engaged in gross human rights violations. But we need to be careful about how early and how broadly we impose those sorts of restrictions on our willingness to work with African countries. So I think we have to do a case-by-case analysis. I think we need to be clear that LGBTQ rights are human rights and they're important to the United States. But I'm also not right now going to draw a clear line and say, if this law becomes law in one country or another, we will immediately cut off assistance. I think that's implicit in my having started by saying we need to show up, we need to be open-handed, and we need to listen to our African partners.
All right, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, thank you so much. We have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you, Zain.